Now, I'm glad to be back here in Little Rock, where I had so many good meals in 1991, 1990, 91, and 92, and a few in 93 as well, and to see my friend Skip Rutherford again. You know, I would call him a lot because, unlike many of the Clinton people, this won't surprise anybody in this room, Skip Rutherford used to like to talk to the press or talk to anyone. And we'd just call Skip up and he'd just talk. You wouldn't even have to ask him a question. I think they've cracked the code here, Skip. And being in the kind of Clinton circle again, I can't resist telling, you can tell I'm not eager to get to the text of this speech. I can't resist telling my favorite Clinton story, which revolves around the 1993 Christmas party, when President Clinton invited a lot of members of the press to the White House, and it was an honor to be invited, and it was much coveted, these invitations. And I remember getting it and being very excited, and my wife and I were going to go, but she's a Washington Post columnist, and she called up and said she was on deadline and couldn't make it. Maybe I should take Elizabeth, who was at the time our 5-year-old daughter. So I did what many people in Washington do. I called the babysitter and asked her to drop the 5-year-old off at the White House. And she, being one of the few 5-year-olds in Washington who was not armed, she was whisked through security, even though she wasn't on a manifest, and I'm not even sure at the time that she even had a social security number. So there was no security clearance for Elizabeth Shribman. There wouldn't be any today either. She's 21 and a senior at Dartmouth College. But in any case, there was no security clearance, and she wasn't on any list. The president didn't know Elizabeth Shribman was coming. Nobody knew. And we were mingled around upstairs, and she stuffed herself indecently, and so did her father. And then there's this moment in these, you'll remember this, Skip, in these Christmas parties where somebody signals that you should start to walk downstairs. And you walk downstairs, and you get in a line. And you have a little card. It says your name, and it will say, Mr. and Mrs. Skip Rutherford of the Federal Corrections Institute of Little Rock. Well, it was pretty close. I mean, there were some days he thought that might be where he'd turn up. And so a Marine Guard, standing at, you're going to regret in this invitation, so, standing at attention, would read the thing, Mr. and Mrs. Skip Rutherford, and then you go and you'd shake President Clinton's hand. You shake the hand of the leader of the free world, and then you'd shake President Clinton's hand, and you'd move on. And the whole thing would take about 8 seconds. But of course, Elizabeth wasn't on the manifest, so I had the card, and the Marine Guard started to say something, and President Clinton said, "Hold it! You don't have to tell me who you. I know just who you are, Elizabeth." It took my breath away too, and Elizabeth, who to this day at 21 is afraid to talk to adults, unlike her father, looked at the president and said, "How do you know?" And the president said, "Because your daddy is so proud of you, you're all he ever talks about." Ooh. And so Elizabeth looks up to me at this Annie Oakley kind of look, and Mrs. Clinton chimes in and says, "That's right, Elizabeth, you're all he ever talks about." Now, it's not as if that the Clintons and us are spending a lot of time together. I probably had mentioned that I had a daughter, Elizabeth, about a year earlier on a long flight that Governor Clinton and I had taken, just the two of us, alone. It was about a 5 or 6 hour flight, and there were no other reporters. And, you know, it's nice to have a chance to talk to the governor of any state, and particularly one who's about to run for president, but even the most fascinating governor of the most fascinating place, that would be Clinton of Arkansas. After about 20 minutes, you run out of things to talk about. So we must have talked about our kids and stuff, and he was actually able to remember 15 or 16 months later, with no prompting. I mean, man has a genius, has a gift and a genius. Anyhow, I'm supposed to stick to the subject, so here we go. The G20 is a big topic here, and anyhow, imagine the reaction if the White House press secretary stood up and announced that the leaders of the 19 biggest nations, Presidents Obama and Sarkozy, Prime Ministers Brown, Harper, and Berlusconi, members of the royal family of Saudi Arabia. We're going to land right here in Little Rock in a few months for the G20 meeting. Now, this is a great town, and no one loves Doe's Eat Place more than I do. But that's not exactly what you here in Little Rock are expecting. And it wasn't what we were expecting in Pittsburgh either last May. I actually was at a diner in Bedford, Pennsylvania, driving east with my wife en route to New England when the cell phone rang. It always rings when I'm at dinner. It was the managing editor, and she was saying that the G20 was coming to Pittsburgh. I didn't believe it, of course, so I mouthed the words G20 and Pittsburgh to my wife, who concluded immediately that Gatorade had chosen Pittsburgh to test market a new version of its drink called G20. Now, there was Snickers in the White House press briefing room when Pittsburgh was announced, and disbelief in our community as well. How are we ever going to pull this off? Then there were the fantasies. Mrs. Sarkozy walking down the streets of Shadyside, shopping in little boutiques on Walnut Street. Berlusconi meeting a cute young thing. No. Wrong room to say that. Prime Minister Harper of Canada huddling with Sidney Crosby, the gifted Nova Scotia hockey player on our own Pittsburgh Penguins Stanley Cup team. None of this happened, of course, and in a way, we can be lucky that it didn't. But the G20 did come to Pittsburgh. The leaders of these big economies did meet. There were minimal but still troubling incidents with police. And then the best part of it all, they all went home. When we got the signal from the airport that Air Force One was in the air, I was delighted. They were gone. It was our town again. Was this fun? Sure it was. Was it hard? Absolutely. Was it convenient? To the nines. For 2 nights, I slept in my office. That wasn't too bad until I realized a bit into the first night that it was a newspaper office I was sleeping in, and there were presses just beneath my bed. Those presses started to rumble, and I wondered whether I'd get any sleep at all. But if the newspaper business should last so long that you all get a chance to sleep over the presses, I recommend you do so. The presses can lull you to sleep the way a railroad car does. It's a wonderful experience, and of course I get to say that I slept with my own presses. Now to the hard part. What did these guys do? Damned if I know. They flew in on a Thursday night, they had a fancy schmancy dinner in a big greenhouse, they went to bed, got up the next morning, met for a bit, and then pronounced to a troubled, trembling world that everything was fine. You think I'm being a wise guy, but I'm not. Now there was, of course, that very disturbing announcement by Presidents Obama and Sarkozy and Prime Minister Brown that there was compelling evidence that the Iranians might be fixing to make a nuclear weapon, and no one can underestimate the importance and danger involved in that. But the rest of it happened so fast it does make you wonder about the value of these sorts of meetings. The G20 always ends the same, with a communique. And if you wonder about the importance of it, I defy anyone in this room to tell me what the G20 communique of 2008 said. I rest my case. And in truth, it's only a few weeks since our own G20, right across town from my office, and I don't have the slightest idea what the G20 communique had. And when I prepared this talk, I had to actually look it up. I actually had to look up what these guys did. And even now, I'm not so sure. Some mumbo-jumbo that maybe your next speaker could decipher, because you picked the wrong guy tonight for that. But I took a look at the communique the other afternoon while I was preparing the speech, and I can tell you that it's not the Declaration of Independence. It begins with some self-congratulatory talk, actually a lot of self-congratulatory talk about a good job, actually a really great job, everybody around the table was doing in fighting the recession. Listen to this. Our forceful response helped stop the dangerous, sharp decline in global activity and stabilize financial markets. Industrial output's now rising in nearly all of our economies. International trade starting to recover. Our financial institutions are raising needed capital. Financial markets are showing a willingness to invest and lend, and confidence has improved. Happy days are here again. Game over. But no, there's more. We pledge today to sustain our strong policy response until a durable recovery is secured. We'll act to ensure that when growth returns, jobs do too. We'll avoid any premature withdrawal of a stimulus. At the same time, we'll prepare our exit strategies, and when the time is right, withdraw our extraordinary policy support in a cooperative and coordinated way, maintaining our commitment to fiscal responsibility. Now, that sounds a little bit like the Democratic National Committee platform. Sounds a little bit like the Republican National Committee platform. It's the same stuff and not particularly well put at all. There's a lot of talk in here about frameworks for strong, sustainable, balanced growth, stuff about being green, lots of stuff about reining in the excesses of banks and other financial institutions, lots of stuff about lots of stuff. Plus this, some brave talk about a global architecture to meet the needs of the 21st century, whatever the hell that means. Well, you get the drift. The import of all this is that the G20 leaders wanted their economies to grow at reasonable levels. They wanted some controls and cooperation on the withdrawal of stimulus funds, and they emphasized financial regulation, plus some vigilance about bankers' pay and bonuses. Clive Crook, who's a very smart person, former editor of The Economist, wrote this. When you think about the part that bad policy played in causing the crunch to begin with, and about how little has been done even now to stop the next slump, this is a bit much. Yes, the instant response to the crisis got some big things right, despite the criticism it aroused at the time. Give some credit where it's due. A global recovery does seem to be gathering pace, which is good, but the recent sense of urgency over fixing some deep remaining problems has started to fade, which is not good. Now, all of this is very sober and sobering stuff, and I'm not here to minimize its significance, only to remind you that it's impossible that a communique like that could have been written in the time these guys were in Pittsburgh. So that you can conclude, as you already did before you drove here tonight, that the whole thing was cooked in advance, which it was, mostly. And in some ways, I'm going to argue that that's okay. No one negotiates the conditions of a marriage on the altar. Lots of that's set in advance, and of course, as many of us know from personal experience, we never really ask the right questions before the wedding. We wonder after the wedding why we didn't think to consider this subject or that. And I'll leave the definition of this or that to all of you who, no doubt, this being the Clinton Library, are still fighting over what the definition of is. Now, Winston Churchill came up with the name Summit for these exercises. Am I going to be invited back here? Winston Churchill came up with the name Summit for these exercises, and he often used the phrase this way, going to the summit, which has a nice antiquarian and Himalayan touch to it. I kind of like it. Churchill loved summits. You almost can't count how many he attended. Quebec on battleships, Tehran, Yalta, North Africa. Some things were accomplished at those places and some things weren't. And our history books use them as shorthand. None more incendiary than Yalta. And if you don't believe it, ask my grandmother, who still, if she were alive, would be beating me over the head about Yalta. It's a word that's taken on a meaning of its own, mostly incorrect. What really was accomplished at these events was that Churchill got to know Roosevelt, and Churchill got to know Stalin, and Roosevelt got to know Stalin, and the three of them, the big three, got to size each other up to see how they looked and how they thought, to see what motivated them and what irritated them, mostly what irritated them, to see if they were men of strength or men of weakness, to ascertain whether they had book intelligence or street smarts, to determine whether, despite the diplomatic outfits, they were at heart gangsters or statesmen. Mostly to decide whether they could be trusted. Now, Margaret Thatcher, who's not often quoted in this building, was much ridiculed for her belief after having met Mikhail Gorbachev that she could do business with him. A lot of smart people snickered, only to reveal how dumb they were. But there's something to what Mrs. Thatcher had to say, and I think that has some applications for the G20 in Pittsburgh. These guys, and by guys I include the Prime Minister of Germany, the word guys being a generalist term of art. These guys were in a room together and they sized each other up and they got to know each other, and in fact they did some business together. President Clinton liked those kind of events very much, and he followed them up with what diplomats call bilats, or bilaterals, which means individual face-to-face meetings. Now that'll happen too. Now I know that Skip promised you, Dean Rutherford, promised you, oh I can't believe it, a look behind the scenes at the G20. I'm sorry to disappoint, because for me the scene really meant sleeping at the office. But I do want to add one thing, and it's not unimportant, dealing as it does with the work we do in journalism and the work Debbie and the rest of you do at the Clinton School. This was a great learning experience, not only for the principals, not only for our city and community leaders, not only for our reporters, but for all of us. For 20 consecutive days, we at the paper ran profiles of the leaders and the countries they represent. That was well received by our readers and enthusiastically endorsed by teachers throughout our area. We learned a lot about international finance, about diplomacy, about how the world works. We confronted very important questions about personal freedom and law and order, and how the clash between freedom and order is not only an academic matter. We confronted important questions about freedom of assembly and about the prerogatives and responsibility of authority. I actually have no idea whether the G20 brought as much as $1 to Pittsburgh. And in fact, I kind of doubt it did. But it raised important questions and forced an entire community to confront them, not as final exam questions in a course, but as real, live, consequential questions in the life of a community. None of that happened behind the scenes, but it was by far the most important aspect of the Pittsburgh Summit 2009. Thank you. Now, Nick is going to
point at people, and then they're going to ask you questions.
And then I'm going to evade them.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
If you do have any questions that he would evade, we'll start with Mary Jane.
And there's no subject off the limits, although my particular area of expertise is the Pittsburgh Steelers.
I'm kind of like a down-to-home person with the basics, and I'm thinking about the logistics, the financing of the G20 summit. I mean, is this like a dues-paying organization like the United Nations? I mean, who pays for all these plenary sessions, and is it like spread evenly across all the countries, or what goes on here?
Would you like a job as an assignment editor of the Post-Gazette? I don't have the slightest idea. It's kind of, I mean, I suppose it's like the UJA or something, or the United Way. Everybody kicks in a little money, but mostly the host nation underwrites most of the costs, and which is why it's so often the United States and Canada, because we could pay for it. Of course, it should be in China, because they're paying for us to pay for it. The next G20 is in a teeny town in central Ontario that you couldn't find even with a map, which is a good thing. But it's not an organization like the, I don't know, is there a Little Rock Club or a city club or anything like that? It's a group of some of the most boring people on earth, and the leaders who appointed them. And they meet kind of off campus a lot. And those are really dull meetings, and nothing happens at those. But it's not like a membership organization where you can buy your way in or something like that. It's much like the United Nations, except we always pay the bills. Yeah.
We'll go right ahead.
First of all, thank you for mentioning my two favourite British people. I appreciate that as someone who worked at Parliament. I appreciate the Thatcher and the Churchill. So you've talked a lot about...
I mentioned Brown, too.
Well, yeah, but I didn't mention Brown. We won't go there.
How about Disraeli, Gladstone?
Yeah, very good, very good. Have you been into the British Parliament at all?
Pardon me?
Have you been into the British House of Commons?
I have been there, yes.
So you know as you walk into, am I boring here? As you walk into the chamber, you have Gladstone and you have Churchill there as well. Mm-hmm. So main two people in our history.
It's kind of like Bob Dole and George Mitchell.
Oh, Tom and Jerry. No, I'm just kidding. So my question is that you've mentioned that it's a good reason for people to get together and kind of get to know each other and, you know, say hello and have a glass of wine or sherry. Is there really anything behind this summit? Because from my reading and from what you're saying, I mean, is there really a benefit to this, or is it more a public PR?
Well, you know, to central bankers and to Treasury secretaries or chancellors of the Exchequer or whatever, there is value to this. But I wouldn't underestimate the importance of the meetings. Now, in earlier ages, this is a different world from, say, the world 100 years ago. 100 years ago from now, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, because you can tell this is not prepared. 100 years ago from today, the Kaiser of Germany, the King of England, and the Tsar of Russia were cousins. they knew each other. They had spent summers together. They had interlocking family events. They went to each other's weddings and their children's weddings, and they had an ease about each other which shouldn't prevent them from hating each other, but they knew each other. This is a different world where leaders change more swiftly. It's not a dynastic world, and it's important, I think, that presidents and prime ministers know each other. And I think that there's a lot's accomplished through familiarity. I'm not an expert on international finance, so I can't tell you really if this was a consequential moment, although not one of us thinks his life has particularly changed since then. But I think it's of no small consequence that Sarkozy, Brown, and Obama made the announcement together about the nuclear weapons. I think it's no small consequence that they got to spend some time with President Lula of Brazil, that they got to spend some time with the leaders of Russia, Saudi Arabia, and I think that's important. I know that sounds superficial, but I think that that's important for all people, for all peoples. And you know, a lot of the work that was done to win World War II was the hard work, of course, was D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge and the North African campaigns. But the really hard work was done over cocktails with President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill. And a lot of that is described in some beautiful detail by Doris Kearns Goodwin. And I think it was very, very consequential.
Right there.
I'm actually from the Pittsburgh area. I grew up in Beaver County, and I'm kind of curious.
Does your family get the Post-Gazette?
They did.
Oh, good.
Along with the Beaver County Times and the Elwood City Ledger. But one thing I'm curious about is having this kind of event come to Pittsburgh. Are there any longer lasting effects of that, do you think? Or was it, I mean, I'm curious, I know there was the immediate impact, but how has that shaped the city kind of going forward?
Well, I mean, I think the question gets to the question of whether there's a positive economic effect to this. And there were a lot of, you know, glowing stories written about. I'm not from Pittsburgh. I lived there for 7 years. I'm very loyal to it. But I have the zeal of the convert. I wasn't born there. But there were a lot of very, very positive pieces in The Economist, The Daily Telegraph, The Guardian, Le Monde, Italian newspapers. We quoted a lot of them, and that has subtle and perhaps lasting value. I don't know exactly whether you can put a price tag on that. As I said in the prepared part of this talk, I think this was a laboratory for us as well to explore some of these other questions. We're still having a debate now. Even when I left the hotel, it was still going on by phone, about this clash between order and freedom, which is at the center of the American question, right? How do you assure order and freedom at the same time? Now, that's a question that we have openly debated here for 230 years. It's the central question in the post-election in Iran, for example. It's the central question in South Africa before Mandela was released. It's one of the central questions, and that we were actually debating it, and we're still debating it in a very yeasty way. So I think there's a lot of value to that. Whether you put a dollar sign on that, I don't know, but it was, I think, it was Oscar Wilde who said that a cynic is the person who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. The value of this was enormous. The price, not quite sure.
Ryan?
In one of the books we're reading, well, first off, thank you for being here. I really appreciate
thank you.
it. I'm a student here. In one of the books we're reading for class by Peter Block, we talk a lot about making a sacred space for meetings. And
Making a sacred space for what?
For meetings, and how important that is to like make sure it looks really nice and it's a friendly environment, et cetera, et cetera. So why do you think it was important? Why, of all the places in the world that they could have gone, why did they come to your city, and why are they picking places like this small city in the middle of Ontario? And is there anything important to
That's
that?
a good question. I think they chose Pittsburgh as a metaphor for renewal, renaissance, and the new economy. You know, as you know, your parents thought of Pittsburgh as a steel town, dirty, filthy, hard to breathe, and you Beaver County, Miss Beaver County there, you know, when your parents were young, if they grew up there, their parents, if they wore a light blue shirt like this in the morning, they would have to change it at noon for lunch because it would be black. When we moved into our house, we had to blast the soot off the stone. It's now perfectly, the air is perfectly good, breathable. Of course, there are no steel jobs. But the city has reinvented itself as a city of higher education, medical research, finance, and clean energy. So that's a metaphor for what the industrialized world has to do, and a metaphor for what the rapidly industrializing, developing world must do in a half of a generation, though it took us in Pittsburgh a generation to do so. So I think the president was looking for a setting in which that message was subliminal, and he was also, I think, looking to thank Dan Rooney of the Steelers for helping carry Pennsylvania. Uh-oh. Revenge time.
I'm easier on you than you have been on me. You touched on it about thanking the Steelers for helping carry the state. Do you think Pennsylvania 2010, Pennsylvania 2012, the Senate race, and the presidency had anything to do with the decision? And then secondly, would you comment, though we had a brief discussion about it at lunch, would you comment on, you know, being on President Obama's selection to win the, receiving the Nobel Peace Prize?
I mean, the Nobel Prize?
Yes.
I heard you were the runner-up. He was runner-up when I won the Pulitzer. Well, that devalues that. Let me just say one thing about the Pulitzer Prize. The centerpiece of that entry was a piece written really around President Clinton, and I think it was called How Presidents Pray. And it was a piece about prayer and faith in the White House. And much of it was historical, involving presidents praying and presidents' spirituality in the White House. And much of it involved President Clinton himself, who, as you all know, but it came as a surprise to me as a Northerner, was steeped in religious language, the cadences of the Bible, much like Lincoln. If you listen to, maybe I'm the first one to compare Lincoln and Clinton in this regard, but if you listen to the speeches of Lincoln, you can't listen to them, but if you read them, and you listen to the speeches of Clinton, they both have a religious Old Testament cadence to them. Now, President Clinton was far more religious than President Lincoln, although President Lincoln's only education came from the Bible. Carolyn Staley was here not long ago, and many of you know her. She's an associate pastor in one of the churches here, and she lived next door to Bill Clinton in Hot Springs, in Hot Springs, and her father was a preacher, as I recall, and she helped me understand some of President Clinton's spiritual searchings. President Clinton used to talk a lot, and I'm sure still does, that his first public civic event was saving up money and going to a Billy Graham session, rally, whatever, prayer session. He used to have in that wonderful car that's in the library there, he probably had 8 tracks, I'm guessing, that he would play gospel songs. He'd go to gospel sings in orchestra. So President Clinton's own sense of spirituality, this is a diversion, Skip, but had a huge effect on me as I prepared this piece, and even had an exchange with President Clinton through George Stephanopoulos, who himself was the son of a Greek Orthodox bishop, I think, or archbishop, on the Psalms that affected President Clinton. He was very fluent in the Bible. Many of his, much of his political opposition, I'm convinced to this day, derives from religious conservatives' resentment about President Clinton's fluency in things spiritual, in the New and Old Testament. And I'm not sure that that's one of the theories that people teach in history classes right now when they talk about the Clinton years. But I'm personally convinced that there was a sense of resentment about the president's appropriation of the language of the Bible and of its rhythms. I've now effectively forgotten the question. I know the second part, that was the Nobel. What was the first part? Oh, politics in Pennsylvania. You know, we have a senator in Pennsylvania who was a Republican about 15 minutes ago and now is a Democrat. That's Arlen Specter. And he's a colorful character, admired by many, liked by almost nobody. But I must say, but admired. And who manages to, I think is the longest serving senator in the history of Pennsylvania, and who manages to win every election by the skin of his teeth. Unknown fact about Arlen Specter, he grew up in the same small town in Kansas, you know this, as Bob Dole, Russell, Kansas. It's the most unlikely thing you can imagine. I think, of course, it's Senator Specter's to lose, and I would say that he might. He might even lose in a primary. As for 2012 and the presidential, you know, I'd be foolish to make a prediction. I would say that President Senator Obama won handily, surprisingly easily in Pennsylvania in the 2008 election, having lost decisively to Senator Clinton in the primary. We'll have to see what the economy's like. We'll have to see all sorts of stuff, but President Obama is very, very popular in Pittsburgh. He's there all the time, I must say. He's in Philadelphia a lot. He's working Pennsylvania very, very hard. And I think that's one of the reasons he brought the G20 to Pittsburgh. We have time for more questions. Oh, Peace Prize. Well, it's kind of like ordering dessert before you have the dinner, the entree. I think it was a premature. I think the president was the only one more surprised than all of us that was the president himself. He kind of woke up and found in his pajama pocket he had a Nobel Peace Prize. Didn't quite know what to do with it. He accepted it, as you know. A lot of people thought he should have declined it. There was a very good column in the New York Times yesterday setting out what President Obama might have said had he declined it. But he took it as an expression of good faith from the world, and I think we ought to look at it as a promissory note rather than as a token or a totem of achievement. You know, we've had 2 other presidents, sitting presidents, win it. I keep talking about Eisenhower. President Teddy Roosevelt won it in 1905 or 4 for his intervention in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, at the end of the Russo-Japanese War, and President Wilson won it for his efforts to win peace. Now you'll notice that that didn't work out so well because Europe was at war again within a generation. So it was a surprise. I think it was awarded to him because he wasn't George Bush.
Time for one more? One right there. Yeah, right there.
You mentioned Iran and the nuclear issue and the G20 coming out. Could you just elaborate about the threat in that region with the G20 working together or not working together?
I have having a hard time hearing that question. Something about Iran, right?
Well, the Iran nuclear issue.
Yes.
You talked about the G20 coming out, at least 4 leaders coming out and trying to work. What promise or progress do we look at or hope for in that issue?
Well, this is a good question. It's about the, Iran was not on the agenda for the G20. It's often the items that aren't on the agenda that are the most important, of course, in any kind of an event. Consider your dinner table discussion with your kids, and you know what I mean. Clearly, Iran and North Korea, along with Al-Qaeda, are the biggest security threats, not only to the United States, but to world peace and more generally. And I think we need to worry deeply about Iran. A nuclear Iran is a very dangerous notion. It puts pressure on Israel, which in turn puts pressure on us. And it does put pressure, many people think, on Egypt and Saudi Arabia themselves to become nuclear nations. Although I'm not so sure about that, because if we can agree that Israel already is a nuclear nation, the possession of nuclear weapons by Israel has not prompted Saudi Arabia or Egypt to have these arms. So why should the possession of another Muslim nation of weapons prompt Egypt and Saudi Arabia to feel they need to be nuclearized? In any case, a nuclear weapon in the hands of Ahmadinejad is not something I think would make any of us comfortable. It's not a congenial thought, it's a terrifying thought, and I think that and North Korea, along with Al-Qaeda, of course, are the principal foreign policy challenges that President Bush had and that he bequeathed to President Obama.
Oh, Kim, one more? One more? Okay, one more. Wait for it, wait for it.
Hi, I'm a student here, and I really appreciate you coming. You said anything was on the table, and that your expertise is the Pittsburgh Steelers. So why do they keep melting in the fourth quarter?
It's happened in 3 games, hasn't it?
How many games have we had this season? 4?
5.
I missed.
Now,
the
are you
last
from
one.
Pittsburgh?
I was reading for class. No, I just got engaged to a guy that makes me watch sports.
Lucky him, huh? Let me tell you, though, the Pittsburgh Steelers are a lot of fun, and they're a great team. And, when we moved to town, I had been a football fan off and on, and it was just energizing to be in Steeler Nation. And I'm glad to know that there's a branch of Steeler Nation right here at the Clinton School. So.